Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And I think I'm in the quarter of this show this year where the entries, I'm just going to be reviewing acts that I otherwise know and like a great deal already. A little bit different than all the discovery and research that came from last year's subgenre, but when the albums are pretty consistently great and I've heard them all before, am I supposed to complain? Now anyway, the story of this artist begins in the late 80s with a duo with the very timely name Simply Two Positive MCs. And the desire to remain more marketable in changing times, they would rename themselves to Organized Confusion and begin releasing critically acclaimed cult albums throughout the 90s. And while a lot of the critics adored them for forward-thinking content and a rather unique sound in the era of gangster rap, their more eclectic and varied delivery and lyricism meant that they never really saw a lot of mainstream success. Kind of a damn shame because they didn't really skimp on hooks or catchiness either, but that happens more than it should in the underground, hell, even today. But 3 albums in, and after a particularly ambitious but mostly failed 1997 album, The Equinox, the duo decided to split amicably and go their separate ways to chase some solo crossover. And when you consider both them have been rapping and producing their own albums throughout that entire decade thus far, it's not surprising at all they wanted to thin out some of the workload, narrow their focus a little more. Now, it would take a relatively long time for member Prince Poe to land his solo debut with The Slickness in 2004 to generally positive reviews, but the other rapper, he would receive more immediate acclaim with his release in 1999 on Raucous, featuring a murderer's row of collaborators and later highlighted as one of the best hip-hop debuts of all time, underground and otherwise. And given that I've talked about this artist before, and it's near the 20th anniversary of this album's release, and the long-awaited re-release on streaming platforms long thought impossible thanks to some sample clearance issues and some label shuffling and re-recordings, it's time to go back to the source. This is Internal Affairs by Pharoahe Monch, and this is Resonators. So you would think that given my familiarity with Pharoahe Monch, and this album specifically, that it'd be a pretty easy album to talk about. It's a classic debut that Pharoahe Monch hasn't quite topped yet, a landmark in the underground released in 1999. It holds up to this day. Let's just be happy it was reissued and finally available on streaming, and go home happy. And that is what I was planning to say coming up doing this episode, until I gave Internal Affairs a few more re-listens, and came to the abrupt realization that the content for this album, and why certain elements haven't really aged as well as you might think, that demands some explanation, both in relating to the album and the era and whence it came. Or to put it another way, Internal Affairs is in a bit of a different lane in comparison with many of the underground projects I've covered on Resonators this year, and also the sort of album I'm not sure would get the same reception should it be released today. Very much of its time and era in the late 90s. I think with 20 years of separation, while I still think this is pretty great, parts of it might not have held up as strongly as many people want to admit. So yeah, I am questioning the legacy of an album that I still do hold is pretty great. And a huge part of this does have to do with the context of the last years of the 20th century. Namely that for as much as I described the pronounced split between the decadence of the shiny suit era and the grubbier underground, even in the mainstream, it was never just that simple. Because for as much as the jiggy era was a thing on the charts, it wasn't precisely dominant, even in hip-hop. And I'm not so much talking about the similar flash of No Limit, but the darker, nastier, more outwardly nihilistic acts that erupted in the backlash, all politically incorrect and violent and in your face as a reaction to the perceived shallowness of the culture at the time, especially in a lot of male-dominated music. Hey, it happened in rock with nu metal, and while it would slide into the underground hip-hop scene through subgenres like horrorcore, it also got mainstream access thanks to acts like DMX and Eminem. Gruff but also extremely angry, hyper-masculine almost to the point of parody, it became the antithesis to the shiny suits of the era, or the more thoughtful and conscious alternative rap from the time like acts like Common or The Roots or Lauryn Hill. So alright, Where the hell does this place Pharoahe Monch in Internal Affairs? Well, it gets a little bit complicated because you can tell he is plenty comfortable shouting opposite M.O.P. and Canibus and other artists who are emblematic of that era, but he's also very much a sharper technical MC, and he does have a little bit more of a conscious, thoughtful side to him, which is why Common and his label mate Talib Kweli, they're showing up on this album too, albeit for a much smaller chunk of the project. It's more likely that they were trying to cross over a few different audiences within the underground, because in comparison with many of the acts that I have covered thus far in Resonators, Internal Affairs could have easily gotten big with the right marketing push and promotion, even from Raucous, and Simon Says even was a very minor single that hit the Hot 100. Hell, the album that's shorter than your average underground behemoth unconcerned with radio, it's a little bit more melodic both in the production and within Pharoah's flows. There are actual hooks this time, a real skill that he kept from Organized Confusion, and as such, for as layered and clever as Pharoahe Monch can be, this is an album that goes down much more easily and more quickly than many coming out of the underground. It's a little less cerebral both then and now, helped along by a more theatrical bark that bent across flows and cadences that still managed to connect all the internal rhymes. I say this could have been big. And it's not at all surprising that Eminem shouted him out on Rap God, as there's absolutely parallels to the technical craftsmanship between both MCs. You can tell that Pharoahe Monch is underrated in that department. And yet, it's also hard not to consider Eminem when you hear a song like Rape on this album, which, yes, it's not talking about an actual woman and more about hip-hop, who Pharoahe Monch fantasizes taking in hyperbolic and yet very specific details, where the line that leads off the second verse is that she had the nerve to take the case to court knowing that I rape for sport. And in comparison to other MCs, they're just not fucking it right. Where right is framed as rape. Even anthropomorphized, that's still all kinds of disgusting, and you know what, even in that era, it probably wasn't okay. But that song and its placement is also emblematic of the weird, quasi-detached, quasi-ironic, very late 90s dichotomy I've already described on this album. Right before that song, we got Queens, a relatively sober tale of a gangland shootout that's so human and detailed, you almost don't notice the homophobic slur that's tossed in. And right after it, we get the big single Simon Says, which plays the hype anthem territory where he's trying to get girls to rub on their titties. But on his second verse, he tries to lampshade it by saying people will call the song sexist. No, it's a song called Rape I would put in that territory. This is just perpetually horny and feels almost a little bit too juvenile and immature to take all that seriously. And that's really the attitude towards sex that's sprayed all over this project, as later we get the track that's charmingly called The Ass, where after his graphic escapades we get Apani in full gangsta boo mold throwing it right back at him, placing this closer to Run the Jewels era ridiculousness than anything played all that seriously, except for when this album does get more restrained and serious, which is on the very next song, The Light, which is a completely convincing and genuinely kind of romantic love song. Hell, outside of the tacked on remix of Simon Says, which in my opinion is better than the original, as most songs tend to get better when you add on Method Man, Raekwon, and Busta Rhymes, the last two songs, they're the Organized Confusion reunion godsend, focusing on the desperate street-level nightmare within Queens, and the latter, it's the conscious moment of self-discovery, the truth with Common and Talib Kweli. And for as convincing as Pharoahe Monch is on cuts like this, you place him on sheer, straightforward, grisly bruisers like Hell with Canibus, No Mercy with M.O.P, The Next Shit with Busta Rhymes, and then right here, behind closed doors, Official, even the intro, he's just as potent. From the alliteration on his verse on Hell to the sports metaphors of Official. I gotta give him credit for the sheer variety on display across the majority of these songs. Even if I'd argue that the whiplash tonal shifts and the missteps, they absolutely do date the project and they've not aged well at all. And again, there are missteps here. Of course, the production is the sort of thing that could easily elevate Internal Affairs, and yet I'd argue it's very much in the same vein of the rapping and content here. It's colorful, it's varied, it's absolutely accessible, but very much rooted in a sound that would feel most at place in the late 90s and can feel a little bit dated to that time. I mean, Hell literally opens up with a dial-up modem effect that's stretched into the guttural bass and the stuttering mix. but that's just the obvious. You got bangers that rely on squonking, heavier melody lines like the intro, the Alchemist flipping the Jerry Goldsmith sample into his really huge banger on No Mercy, the tinny guitar pickup amplified right into Right There, and most notoriously, an uncleared sample of Godzilla on Simon Says that wound up placing Rawkus in court and stalling out the reissue and distribution of this album for years or even decades to come. And from there, it's hard not to feel like the production was chosen more to flatter some of the guests than Pharoahe Monch directly, from the more jittery percussion off the bouncy plucks for the next shit with Busta Rhymes, and that totally makes sense for him, to the much more elegant strings on The Truth that's clearly for Common. Now, certainly these were chosen better than any tones that were trying to sound more eerie or hellish to match the album art with the more grisly subject matter in the verses, which even for the time don't always nail the atmosphere, with the most jarring case coming on Rape with the twinkling Quincy Jones sample off the scratching that doesn't match any in the mood at all. But beyond that, outside of some of the mean nitpicking, some questionable vocal mastering on Queens and Godsend that doesn't quite match the fidelity of the rest of the album, this is a project that goes down pretty easy. I like a lot of the melodies here. The album still slaps when it needs to, and I dare say the melodic focus has only helped this last as a really gateway album into the underground. But as a whole, going back to Internal Affairs, I found myself wanting to like it as much as I did 5 or so years ago the first time I heard it, but through the process of putting together the series and learning more of the history, you begin to understand why it might have slipped out of the limelight. Ironically, it's a project that's seen backlash from different avenues over the years. Hell, 10 years ago, people were annoyed with the concessions to blunt anthemic moments instead of just sheer wordplay, whereas I take more issue with some of the deeper implications of songs like Rape and some of that wordplay now, in comparison with finding the bangers actually really likable. But in both cases, you can chalk it up to where this streak of mainstream adjacent hip-hop was at the time. It's not really excusable, but it is understandable. And as such, while there are real missteps, I'm still giving this a light 8 out of 10 and recommendation, but with the heavy qualifier that if you don't have a taste for the sounds of the time, especially some of the bangers, I can see you being a lot colder on this. From here, Pharoahe Monch would go on to have a scattered but pretty acclaimed career, and if you want to trace his origin in a fascinating time capsule of boot, Internal Affairs, it's worth the investigation. If you're curious, give it a listen. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine this might be a little controversial with this album in specific, because again, a lot of people love this, but I think a lot of people haven't gone back to certain songs in 20 years. But if you want to buy or stream it, links down there below, and I got the poll up there. I am curious where people fall on this, especially if you haven't heard it and you're going back to it now. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you're looking for other episodes of Resonators, or other album reviews, or the newest episode of Billboard Breakdown, links in the card right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Resonators on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.